So I'm going to briefly review like how the FDA classifies risk, so you guys have some context compared to the other markets that we've talked about. Some of this I'm going to move through pretty quickly. So if you want to talk more about this, either send me a direct message or an email later, and we can schedule a call to follow up. So in the US, there are like three and redheaded stepchild of device categories, and those are class 1, class 2, class 3, and unclassified. So unlike Europe, we don't have subdivisions of 1, 1S, 1R, 1M. We don't have 2A, 2B. But that doesn't mean that it's necessarily any more clear cut. And then we've got this weird little category that's unclassified. Most of these are pre-amendment, meaning when they first put the regulations in place that are product specific in the US, there was this group that for whatever reason, they didn't create a regulation for. These are risk-based. About 40 to 45% fall into a class 1 category. Class 2 makes up another 40 to 45%. And those higher risk and unclassified devices really only make up 5 to 10%. And they're usually like things like either high risk implants or life-supporting, life-sustaining devices. This is really unique to the way that FDA has organized exemptions and requirements for different classifications of device. We really have 3 sets of controls. You've got your general controls. So no matter what, even for all your class 1 devices that might be 510K exempt and GMP exempt for a certain subset, you're going to have some basic requirements, but they are very minimal. Class 2 have other types of requirements, including the requirement of a 510K, other special controls like guidance documents, and then class 2 PMAs, require this kind of different, more complex submission. Generally, the unclassified devices require what's called a 510K. So long story short about all of that, you can see this is a matrix of what type of control, submission requirements, and trials that you may end up with. So it can be, while it is a blessing to have a whole set of exemptions that generally don't apply in other geographies, it can also be very complex to navigate and make sure that you do have the right and basic set of requirements. So in the US, there are 5 basic steps to market, and we'll touch on each of these quickly. So the first is to define the product. This is done by defining your intended use, which is your core concept at the basis of the FDA regulations. It refers to the objective intent or purpose, which can be shown by the labeling, the advertising materials, the oral written statements, the implied or express claims, what you do on social media. So it's much more than just a regulatory statement that appears in your documentation and your design history file. You can think of your intended use like an overarching umbrella that kind of defines the overall context of what your device does. And the indications for use are very specific subsets of that intended use that fit within that umbrella. These can be anything like a target population, a duration of use, or an anatomical site. And this is the indications for use are going to build, we're going to build on that throughout our regulatory strategy into our market commercialization. So it's really important to clearly articulate it, because it can also determine if you meet the definition of being a medical device at all, particularly if you're in the digital health space and you have a software or an app-based product that may or may not meet this definition. And primarily a medical device is going to diagnose, cure, mitigate, treat, or prevent a disease or condition.
It does this by what is called a mode of action that is structural or mechanical in nature, which means it can't be metabolized or otherwise chemically processed by the body in a way that a drug is. So now that we have our intended use statement and we verified that our product is a medical device, we're going to move into how to determine the classification and pathway. Well, the FDA, and this is something that's unique, at least until UTMed is in full swing in the EU, which is a good ways away. The FDA has always had a myriad of FDA databases. There are probably around a dozen or so. I typically start my product classification with a product code classification database and do different keyword searches that involve my intended use and indications for use. It also has very helpful information about your competitors in the Device Establishment Registration and Listing database and the 510K database. And then there are others that are really helpful as you're formulating that early regulatory strategy. And again, this kind of sets the US market apart. So once we understand our classification pathway, then we're going to move into developing the valid scientific evidence that we need to support that strategy. So this can take a range of different forms in the terms of, being non-clinical benchtop testing, performance standards, recognized consensus standards, animal or clinical, and FDA's new favorite is usability engineering or human factors. There are very few submissions anymore that are going to, that the FDA is accepting without some level of usability or human factors, at least assessment, if not testing. So, and then in the US, there are different types of pre-market submissions, and that these can range anything in the realm of intensity from a walk in the park to an Ironman marathon, because you could fall into one of those class 2, or there's a handful of class 1 devices are generally 510K exempt, but then there's a subset that requires 510Ks. Class 2 devices usually require 510Ks, but there's a very small subset that are exempt from 510Ks. Then there's the de novo, which means of new. And then there is those class 3 devices that require pre-market approval. And that's a little bit more like training for an Ironman. So the 510K makes up the vast majority of submissions to the FDA. This is the pre-market submission for low and moderate risk devices. It's based on a concept known as substantial equivalence, which is a comparison between your product and a legally marketed device, where you compare the intended use, the device features, and the performance testing. So next to getting the intended use and indications for use statement right, this is one of the next most critical decisions that you can make, is choosing the right predicate device for this comparison, because this is going to be the argument that you're going to make throughout the body of your entire submission. A de novo is a submission for a device that has no existing classification regulation or clear predicate. Like I mentioned when I discussed the product classification database, the FDA actually has separate regulations and separate product codes for every product it regulates. And you use the intended use to guide you to picking the regulation that best fits your intended use statement and product features. That's another unique thing about it about the US compared to the EU and other markets. Because those are generally more rule-based, and it's just a handful of rules, not like specific to drilling down to, thousands of different product types like the US does. This is the marketing act process for novel devices because you don't have a regulation or a clear predicate. And you can't make that substantial equivalence determination because of that. So at the end of a de novo, it creates a new classification regulation. So the de novo process can actually be really powerful if you understand that you get to recommend to FDA during the course of the de novo contents the special controls. Special controls can be specific performance criteria. You can require clinical trials. You can require human factors, dozens of tests. So the people that really are strategic about this, these are actually some of the most detailed regulations that the FDA has drafted. And they're also some of the more restrictive if you're trying to bring a competitive device to market. This is an alternative to the pre-market approval, and it's for those devices that are kind of in between that life-supporting, life-sustaining, high-risk implant, where you have a reasonable belief that because of their benefit risk, they're going to end up being ultimately classified as a class 2, and in some cases, maybe even a class 1. And in general, this is a reduced regulatory burden and cost based off of the risk-benefit profile of the device. PMAs are the pre-market approval. This is the market application for the highest risk of devices, and it gives you a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. And in general, all the data and evidence you turn into a PMA can stand on its own. So you're not relying on a substantial equivalence discussion, and the FDA is inspecting your data. Not are you enough like your predicate, but they're looking at your data as, does this stand alone in terms of safety and efficacy? And that's why you can call these devices approved rather than cleared or granted. So roughly, if you look at how the 510Ks, de novos, and PMAs compare, you have got the 510Ks, again, that these are kind of submission-wise one of the easier cases to make. These are right around 1,500 and up pages. If you've got software and cybersecurity, I've seen one get as crazy as 6,000 pages. De novo is going to be, at least 2 to 3 times that in scope. And a PMA is, what comes out to be about 30 plus 3-inch 3-ring binders. The 510K process, this is, I think, the whole review time based off of the classification risk is another big difference in what to expect when you compare this to the MDR technical file review specifically. Is the FDA clock time for 510Ks is generally 90 days, and they're running right around 200 days, regardless of the type of device that you're having reviewed. De novo, the clock time is 120 days. These are actually running about 400 days on average. PMAs, this is the funniest one to me. 180 days is the FDA clock time, but these are really pushing the 800 to 900 range. You don't have to have a pre-approval inspection, which, in the EU, you do have to have your quality management system inspection and your technical file documentation kind of all cleared or certified, kind of moving in some level of parallel where they all eventually come together. Whereas in the United States, it's really only the pre-market approvals where you have to have a pre-approval inspection. The user fees, this is the FDA fees. This ranges anywhere from about $5,000 up to $120,000 if you have a small business designation. And so the fees are significantly reduced over other market geographies.
For a 510K, you can say these are cleared. De novos, you can say cleared or granted. And then when you end up in that pre-market approval, that's the only time you can say FDA approved. So that's an important distinction, or the FDA will deem your products misbranded and adulterated in their advertising. So advantages of the US market. So in the United States, the FDA is the FDA. It's really the only agency. Technically, we have about 5 or 6 third-party reviews, but they do their reviews and then they have to turn their review into the FDA, and the FDA is the final authority if you get cleared or not. Whereas in the EU, you have, dozens, a little over 2 dozen now, almost 3 dozen notified bodies who can all be your reviewers. These are private entities. So while the EU is moving to try to get these groups all trained together so everybody gets the same information at the same time to standardize their interpretation, that traditionally hasn't been most people's experience with the review process with the notified bodies. These are also individual, private, for-profit, as opposed to government entities. Each notified body, once they certify your technical documentation, they now become the defenders of your technical documentation in front of national competent authorities. And there are, for every country there in the EU, there is at least one competent authority, if not a handful. So this can get to be, especially if you have a problem in the market, this can be quite onerous and quite the level of liability for the notified body. So because of that difference in governance structure, coupled with the challenges that the MDR and that higher bar that the MDR has brought, particularly in the areas of clinical documentation, we've had a paradigm shift in that go-to-market strategy where, the EU used to have the reputation of being easier to entry, lower clinical trial requirements. Those have actually shifted as MDR has come closer and closer to fruition. If you compare and contrast both the ways of communicating and the budget you need to have for that communications, both before and during the technical review process, in the FDA, we have got a number of ways that you can engage with the FDA for free. The only cost to you is the cost to get maybe to have somebody prepare the submission to the FDA and maybe some initial protocols. The notified bodies, they really don't have anything like a pre-sub. Some of them have a little bit of a pre-assessment process about are you ready or not, but it's not certainly not free and not to the level of communication that you get through the pre-sub process. Right now, it's also difficult to find to have application process successfully completed. And part of that is due to the notified body, both qualifications and capacity. You may be knocking on doors trying to find a notified body, especially now as we're ticking down to May 26th, that has got the time and resources to even be able to process your application. If you look at the cost of an actual review, the 510Ks, like we saw, is on the neighborhood of $5,000. In general, these pale in comparison to the amount of money that you're going to spend between the review rounds with the notified bodies. And I have even had a client with a 2A sterile commodity product that had been on the market in the EU for 50 years, that their notified body, treated it like it was a whole brand new thing had never been on the market before, and they finally rescinded their application after they had gotten over $100,000 in fees and couldn't were at an impasse on certain technological features that they didn't all agree on the interpretation of the product. Another advantage, and this is pretty significant, is the small business designation. So if you make less than $100 million a year, and that's globally, you are considered a small business in the US, which means your fees are deeply discounted between 50 to 75%. And as of yet, there is no such discount across the notified bodies just because you're a small business or a startup. So don't pass up the power of a pre-submission. Again, it's free. And this is like inviting the FDA to almost be like a part of your problem-solving team. You give them an opportunity to, before you're in submission, introduce your technology to them and find out where they stand. What is their current thinking? What is their understanding? Is there gaps in their understanding? Is there gaps in your understanding? So this is a really powerful process. You can ask very specific questions around your protocols. You can't turn in data, but you can turn in protocols that you haven't run. You can get feedback about acceptance criteria, sample sizes, statistical plans, and more. And did I mention it's free? Other types of pre-submissions that are really important for either novel or safer or more effective technologies are the breakthrough or in the safer technologies or STEP programs. These are also no-cost pre-submissions where you make a case for your product that it meets certain criteria for either breakthrough or STEP. If you get these designations for your novel or safer technology, in theory, the FDA is supposed to be a little bit more of your partner in your submission and not your product development in terms of technology or design inputs or outputs, but definitely, like, for instance, on a clinical trial, where could you negotiate possible endpoints? And there's supposed to also be a method of, once you get them, you can more informally engage with the FDA where they kind of become your partner. And maybe instead of putting it through a formal pre-submission request, they might engage you offline via emails for certain levels of dialogue. For guidance documents, I think that this is another big advantage for the FDA, because not only do you have those product-specific regulations like we talked about, but many of them also have these guidance documents that tell you what FDA's current thinking is on a particular either topic like sterilization or biocompatibility, or a particular product type like IV sets or infusion pumps. So in the US, there are a lot more guidance documents that are available. I think they're in the vicinity of about 700 for medical devices. They're very detailed and specific, whereas in the EU, there are some, and we're getting more as we progress towards the MDR, but they're a little bit more general and a little bit more system oriented, as opposed to this level of detail where you can see what they are thinking specifically about a product or topic. Clinical trials are typically not required for 510Ks, which again make up the bulk of the submissions in the United States. So this is like a huge cost savings. And you also, because we have the pre-submission process, even if you do have to do a clinical trial, you can discuss it with the FDA via the pre-submission process, which can also save you a lot of time and money ahead of time. eStar is becoming, it has its strengths and weaknesses, but overall, it is a huge help into getting the right types of information in the right places to make sure that your submission is complete and meets FDA expectations. So this is an interactive PDF system that the FDA's come up with to both create and compile your submission and then submit it and upload it to the portal that is supposed to facilitate their review. It has tons of all these blues here are help text that give you, point you to maybe specific guidance documents about how to make the right selection here, or maybe clarify some of their expectations in terms of they've got some very specific recommendations in their biocompatibility and cybersecurity sections. Disadvantages of the US market. It's right now, it's really made a kind of around both COVID and those guidance documents. So the guidance documents are a little bit of a double-edged sword. The COVID turnover, really, we had so much new staff and loss and attrition of older people that knew the systems and ways. So that's given a lot of inconsistency to the reviews. So you might not really know what to expect or have had the same experience from both reviewer to reviewer within a division, but especially within divisions. And that's right up to high-level interpretation of policy. And then those guidance documents, the FDA publishes about between 50 and 60 a year. So their current thinking is constantly evolving, and it can be difficult to keep up with. Also, for things that are published in draft, I regularly hear from my clients who aren't quality and regulatory people, well, that's just a draft. I don't have to pay attention to it because even finals are non-binding. And all that's true, but again, these reflect FDA's current thinking. And if you're not aware of what they're thinking, you're not going to be aware how to respond to it, and you're going to be caught off guard with your additional information requests. So I'm just gonna, I've got just a handful of slides on the QMSR, or the Quality Management System regulation, which came out just last Friday. I'm not going to get into any detail here because I'm doing a whole separate presentation. We're going to do a whole hour on just the QMSR. So I'm going to kind of skip through these, but just know that that's here now and it's coming, and we're going to do a deeper dive on it. It was published again last Friday. We're going to have 2 years to comply. It's going to be a big transition for both industry, but for the FDA as well in terms of their inspection methodology. They're calling it substantially similar to ISO 13485 with a few key differences. Again, stay tuned, and we will talk about that in just about a month. So monitor those FDA guidance documents and updates. Know that QMSR is coming. Be prepared. Make sure that you select the right regulatory path. There's a lot of nuances with the FDA, and really capitalize on those FDA pre-submissions. You could go to my website and get a regulatory pathway assessment and a variety of other tools if you care to. And so just let me know how it can be helpful.